Hello there, and welcome to the first video in this playlist, which I call Strategy Patterns. Now, I already have a pretty big playlist when it comes to checkmate patterns and tactical patterns. So these are the building blocks of your chess to build up the mating pattern so you can conduct an attack, to build up the tactical patterns so you'll recognize opportunities to win material or to initiate mating attacks. But there's also strategy that you need to master. Some middle games require certain things and some require another. In this video, we're going to learn about a strategy pattern that I first became aware of when I saw a game by the world champion, Vishwanathan Anand. Of course, the former world champion. One of the greatest chess players of all time, still alive and kicking and active and among the top players in the world. But this was played against Sergei Tivyakov around the turn of the millennium. And Anand had the white pieces here, and he played the move King A2. And this is Anand's king. This is what we will be talking about, showing some examples. And the example is the safety of this king behind these wall of pawns. So the white pawns, the friendly pawns and the enemy pawns, they make a huge shelter for the king and make it extremely safe. And this is very useful, especially when we have an endgame with only the heavy pieces. With only a queen and a rook, this is where this pattern becomes most important, because it's so difficult to attack this king. There's no firepower, there's no bishop, there's no knight creeping around. It's just the heavy pieces. And when you have such a king, you are going to be able to attack your opponent's king almost without worrying about your own king, because it takes so much time for your opponent to checkmate your king. Now let's see how the game progressed. Tivyakov took on a g4, but it's hard to suggest, actually in what follows, it's hard to suggest improvements for black, so perhaps this might be just a lost position. He went for counterplay with rook to h8. We had queen f4. Rook takes h4, decides to eliminate this pawn, but then he has to give up the pawn on f7, because queen f6 is threatened, picking up the rook, as well as taking the pawn, but Tivyakov played queen e5, intending to stay safe with the king on h6. The queen covers some squares, and it's not immediately mated. But in what follows, the main factor is going to be the safety of the white king. So we're going over this game, we're not learning this is not a forced variation. That's not what you should be learning or maybe paying attention to, but just observe how difficult it is to play when you have the king that's in danger, and how easy it is to play when you have the king that's safe. So white starts to make threats. Rook f6, threatening mate here. Black gets a pawn, but it doesn't matter. He's completely lost. Rook e6. And the first annotations that I saw on this game by Grandmaster Dorian Rokosenko, he said, in his opinion, it's almost impossible to defend such a position. The thing is, the king just lacks shelter, and as soon as white starts making threats, it's going to be impossible to play. And this is a good pattern. When you have a queen and the rook attacking, once you start making checks and the king is out in the open, it's just game over. So here Tivyakov tries queen g7, the queen goes back to f3, attacking the rook, who is lacking squares. Queen back to d4. We could try something like rook d4, queen e3 check, and now the king is wide open, and this is not going to end well. Okay, queen d4 was played, queen h8 check. Now the king has to run, because if you go back, there's rook e7, so king h5, and now Anand picks up a pawn. Rook takes d6, queen e5, queen d8, and we see this very often. One side is dominating a file, we have a queen and a rook, dominating a file, threatening this, and the options are just, so varied. You could, in one swoop, you can maybe swing the rook over, you can swing the queen over, and black always has to be careful. Let's see what happened here. Rook d7, eyeing this square. King comes now out in the open, and now Anand goes for the king, queen e3, but now rook d4, and turns out queen e3 was a blunder, but already black was probably lost. It was very difficult to find the move. The reason it's lost now is if you go to the third rank, I will play rook d3, pick up your queen, and if you go back, you are actually just made it in one move. So black loses the queen. He played on for a while, but to no avail. Now, here we see another example. And this time it was Mikhail Gurevich, one of my favorite players, who had the white pieces against Leonid Totsky. After this, I had the pleasure of playing on the same team with Misha Gurevich. Played on my team, the Westman Islands. And later had very good chats with him at some tournaments. A really nice guy and an excellent player and teacher. And he played in the starting position. He played pawn to h4, setting up the same type of position. The safe king here on h2. In Anand's case, this was on a2, but this is the same pattern. The safe king, and we have the heavy pieces. Rook b8, and Gurevich is controlling a file. So this will be very difficult for black to survive. White can sort of choose the file he wants to dominate, and we'll see in this example, queen d3 followed by rook d5, so he decides to switch over to the d file. It's more central, and you control it better because it's a square maybe that black controls, so slight more file control. The rook can never go anywhere because of this, and it's really difficult. After queen c6, Gurevich played rook d4, eyeing this. Now if you're going to protect the pawn, then we can take the 7th, so black kind of has to give up the pawn, and he decides to do that with rook a8. Now Gurevich took the pawn, and it turned out great in the game, but I think he should have done what the Russians say, don't rush, and just maybe queen d2, cover the second rank, make black make a move. You're eyeing this, maybe you have some h5 later, maybe you can play rook d6, put the queen on d4 and control some stuff here. There's no rush because your king is so safe. He took the pawn, and here if black does nothing, then this pin is actually kind of annoying because we can't move the rook, and maybe we have to go to a rook ending, which is much more difficult to win and probably a draw. But here black blundered, but it shows if he had taken control of the second rank or played rook d6, something like that, and then just take the pawn on g4 later, that was probably a better way. But it turned out okay because this was actually an error here by black. He wants to take the rook on e4, but a series of checks here by Gurevich. Now the king must go to h6 because if you go to the 8th rank, there's check, and now we have to trade queens, so you have to go here. But now queen e8 mate threat, so we have to trade on e4, and after g4 the pawn ending is winning. White's going to pick up this pawn, and it's going to be a GG. Now one example from black's point of view. Vladimir Malanyuk had the black pieces here, and we see that he has a very safe shelter for his king, Anand's king, here on h7, and he will go there. Actually, immediately, rook h7. Queen f2, offering a trade. But we don't want a trade because we want the heavy pieces on. We have the safe king. We want a queen and a rook to do the attacking. Queen d7, just probing, no rush. All we have to do is avoid white controlling the 8th rank or completely controlling the 7th rank without us being able to control g7, perhaps by a queen somewhere in the future. Rook e5, rook d8, covering the pawn. And here black goes on a mission with the a pawn just to cramp white's pawns here before commencing with active operations. Rook c8. And we see through all of this, the king is just sitting pretty here. King f2. And with the position open like this, it's so difficult to play for white. And this game was actually just a few more moves. After queen f8, the rook came back. Queen e7, but now the queen enters, queen to g4. And we see that still it's taking too much time to enter. And even if we did, well, we simply don't have time for it. Queen takes h4. And here white blunders in an otherwise basically lost position. He played king e3, and we can pick up the queen. So in all these examples, our opponent was a grandmaster or stronger, or close to grandmaster. Including in this last example, where we kind of have a look at how we can steer the game towards what we want. And here, Alexander Grischuk had white, and I think this is a tremendously good example. So his bishop it's nothing special. It's blocked by these pawns, blocked by these pawns. So he lures his opponent, Vlad Tkachev, who's a very, very strong player. He lures him into kind of what he wants. He plays h4. And now it's very tempting to play g4. Take on g3 and play g4, which is exactly what Vlad Tkachev did. And now knight d2. Offering the trade of knights. Why? Because we know that this strong king position favors us when we have only heavy pieces on the board. The king just goes for a cup of coffee, maybe a cup of tea, and just watches his soldiers do all the heavy lifting. Queen e3, queen f5, and guess what? Cup of coffee, king h2, cup of coffee with Anand. So Wishy, how do you like your tea? Do you like mint tea or lemon tea? Or maybe apple tea? Okay, no. King g7, queen e8. Starting to think about some penetrations. c5. Note that black has a pawn majority, 4 against 3 on the queen side. And actually did so in Anand's example as well, on the king side. But it doesn't matter because the activity of the pieces and the safety of the king is what matters. Rook e5, attacking the queen. And here again we see the side with Anand's king controlling a file, because you have so many options and things just become unbearable after a while. Here Grischuk picks up a pawn, now he's up a pawn, and black's pieces are still basically in a puddle of mud trying to defend the king. Queen e3, thinking about maybe rook e6, eyeing this. See, the king just sits here and the heavy pieces do the lifting. Rook e6, rook f6. And now we have a small dance. The queen does a steeplechase here. Queen c7, queen c6. Again, we can pick this up, It's just a matter of taste. Grischuk goes for queen e4. Rook g6. The queen has to go out. Well, actually it can't go out because of this, so it has to keep an eye on this. And now we take on a6. And now the queen goes out actually. But now we take on h6. So it's a lost case. Black never has time to do something like this. His only threat, because he is under attack, and after rook h7, he resigned. So this is Anand's king. It's more or less mostly applicable to when we have these heavy piece endgames, in my opinion. But throw them likes, because I'm about to give you another good example, our final example. And now we don't have the heavy pieces. We will have a queen and a bishop. So just to show you that This can apply in other positions. This king position is very safe, very good. And what we'll see here, it's very similar. I would say the same pattern. So this is a game between Seiravan and Tal. And Seiravan, he took with the f pawn here. It looks more natural to take with the h pawn. But it turns out, after a trade here, let's say something like this. And okay, let's say we want to win. We keep the queens on. I don't know if we go here or queen here. It doesn't really matter. Once we start to get active, we always have to worry about, let's say the queen comes over here, wins a pawn, goes on a mission to a7. Then we have to be careful about black entering here, giving a check, giving another check here. And it's going to be a perpetual. The king doesn't have shelter. So the safety of the king. So that's why, against Tal, Seiravan played f takes g3. And this is to give the king shelter, much like Anand's king that we saw earlier. So he wants to press, so we need pieces. Generally we need heavy pieces, queen and rook, but we definitely need the queen. So Seiravan plays queen e1, he avoids the queen trade. The ending was not his idea to trade queens. Bishop e6, b3, protecting the pawn on a2, c5, and h3. Guess what? We're going to come here. In this case, there are no black pawns, like in the pure Anand's king, but very, very safe, very similar. b5 and b4. So in what follows, after queen d8, we actually eventually get the king on h2. So just avoiding any funny business on h3. Now we get the king completely safe. There's no pressure on g2, and that's the important thing. There's never a bishop on this long diagonal teaming up with the queen, so the king is perfectly safe. Bishop d5, and somewhere we can most likely find somewhere where Tal could have defended better. But the fact of the matter is that this is the decisive thing. Pawn takes g3. That was the key move. To give this king this shelter, much like Anand's king. And now Seiravan starts to pick up some pawns. And he's just using the power of the queen and the bishop on the dark squares. Black can defend. White doesn't have to worry about his own king. Much like when you have the heavy pieces, you control a file, you make a threat. And here we picked up some pawns, and now we just penetrate with the queen. And eventually game over. He's going to win another pawn. So this was Anand's king strategy pattern number 1. Hope you enjoyed it. We'll add a few more to this. Hopefully it will be a big playlist like the others. And yeah, here we're learning more like, concepts, strategy. So we're not learning like, trying to memorize variations. We're trying to memorize concepts. So I hope this was helpful to you. And if it was, please leave a like and see you in the next one. Bye-bye.